Through gates long closed, the warrior of light and his companions passed, entering at last a city whose history was written in blood. In the midst of the Dragon Song War they came, 3 weary travelers whose arrival would set in motion great change. Though none knew then how great.
Final Fantasy 2.0 was a revival unlike anything we have ever seen before in terms of MMOs. The idea that you could have such an agreed upon failure only to build something arguably better from the ashes sounds almost impossible. But we saw this happen with the release of A Realm Reborn alongside well-placed content patches that kept people not only playing the game for the sake of it, but also getting to experience new things, create new goals, and follow along an ever-evolving storyline. But even with the success of 2.0, the question remained, where do we go from here? Square Enix and Yoshi P had something good going for them, and it was easy to wonder, would they continue to improve on the MMO, or would they ultimately let it slip by them only to see the death of 14 all over again? Well, the answer of where we are going is up all the way to the heavens. Today we'll be looking at Final Fantasy XIV's updates from 3.0 to 3.5, as well as all minor patches within them. We'll see the introduction of flying mounts into the game and discuss the inclusion of new beast tribes, new dungeon mechanics, and much more. Even if it's not the initial base release of the MMO, 3.0 brought with it a lot of new content, some of which is still a huge factor into the leveling and progression of characters overall. Additionally, I'll be attempting to streamline this video slightly while covering all major points I think need covering. If you enjoy these videos, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. A lot of work and research goes into these videos and every little bit helps. If I get anything wrong or you feel like I missed anything important, please feel free to let me know in the comments so I can make corrections. Finally, keep in mind that these games have what feels like an endless amount of content. While I plan to go over major points and additions, there will always be something that falls through the cracks. Oh, don't forget, there will be plenty of potential spoilers in this video, so you've been warned. With that out of the way, I'm Super Rad, and this is the history of Final Fantasy XIV 3.0 Heavensward. This video is sponsored by AdvancedGG, the gamer supplement for gamers. You're gaming. It's so good for gaming. I never thought I'd be a gamer supplement kind of guy. I never thought I would try that out, but they did send me some of their products to like preview, and I did end up enjoying them. I looked into them a little bit more, saw that they had no filler, were reasonably priced, and all in all had like a pretty good experience with all of them. I tried mostly a couple of the focus flavors, which are good for like, you know, helping you focus while working. I'm constantly at my computer. I'm easily distracted, so that one was a nice one to have. And sour watermelon from Sir D was my favorite. Apparently he's a Destiny streamer. I don't know who you are, Sir D. I'm sorry. They're fantastic, high quality products, and I highly recommend you check them out. Super Rad, sponsored by AdvancedGG. Find the link below in the description. Okay? Thank you. The development of Heavensward began at least a year prior to its release, with the team having all of A Realm Reborn's storyline leading up to 3.0 solidified by patch 2.1 in December of 2013. This was essentially a line in the sand for the development team and would be the solidifying factor on whether or not Final Fantasy XIV would sink or swim as an MMO. Should Heavensward be successful both financially and as a continuation of A Realm Reborn, it would show that the team truly understood what it took to make a successful MMO and would help allow said MMO to survive in future expansions. Initially, the overall theme for the expansion was between two options, those being the sea or the sky, with Heavensward obviously focusing on the sky element and locations where flying would not only be incorporated but incentivized near the end of the main storyline in 3.0. Luckily, however, the sea element wouldn't be thrown away and would instead be incorporated as the main theme of Stormblood and 4.0, adding to the theme of the sky sky was a theme of gothic fantasy, which fit well with the game's new setting of Ishgard, a Coerthas-based location that was not only in A Realm Reborn, but also all the way back in 1.0. Many players were incredibly eager to finally visit said location and learn more about Coerthas and its surrounding locales. On top of the gothic fantasy setting, the development team wanted to focus on a storyline that wouldn't simply be built off of previous Final Fantasy games like A Realm Reborn was. Instead, the team wanted to create something completely original, focusing on the themes of religious conflicts, religious dogma, and themes of racism that would be looked into and built around for the narrative of Heavensward. The expansion was story-gated by the MSQ of A Realm Reborn and would require players to complete it in order to access the majority of, if not all of, the new Heavensward content. In an interview in Time magazine, Naoki expressed that the first expansion of 14 was a season 2 of sorts, and not something you would experience before watching a show's first season. That being said, he expressed interest in removing this story gate in future expansions. However, this only really happened partially. Despite a desire to add more freedom to the player in what they took part in, similar to Final Fantasy XI, the MSQ of Final Fantasy XIV is fairly linear and requires the players to complete quests in order to progress naturally. In this same interview is where we saw Yoshida hint at implementing a story skip service, something that would later be implemented, allowing players to skip the story of A Realm Reborn completely for a fee and start fresh in Heavensward. They'd also release packages that allowed players to level specific battle classes to make progression a bit easier. The main score of the expansion was composed by Masayoshi Soken, who had worked on the game since its reshuffling in 2010. Not only is Soken the main composer, but he also formed a band known as the Primals with other members of the sound team that play events at the fan festivals and also release their own albums. Dragon Song, the main theme of Heavensward, was composed by Nobuo Uematsu, a staple for the Final Fantasy series, and was weaved into various segments of music within the game's OST by Soken. On the technical side of things, the game was still offering support for the PS3 even though the PS4 version was out, but this was planned to end by the end of the Heavensward life cycle. The game also saw an upgrade from DirectX 9 to 11, which allowed for a few graphical improvements, physics improvements, and better stability overall. However, the macOS version suffered from many technical difficulties due to the shift from DirectX to OpenGL, another graphics processing language. On top of this, players could only buy the Mac version of Heavensward within a bundle with 2.0, and the minimum system specs were incorrect, leading to many players being unable to run the game even though they were led to believe that they could. This led to refunds until patch 3.2 when the Mac version was re-released. As mentioned previously, the theme of Heavensward is religion, gothic fantasy, and the effects of racism. This leads us to the main new hub area known as Ishgard. Spanning from the east to the west of Aldenard is a mountain region known as Abalathia's Spine. Here is where players can find the wintry area known as Coerthas, which has been partially explored in A Realm Reborn, as well as the Holy See of Ishgard, which until now has kept its gates closed from the rest of the Eorzean Alliance for quite some time. However, the Knights of Ishgard are in constant battle with the dragons of the land, leading to the Archbishop, who acts as the sovereign of Ishgard, to accept help from outside their city. Now, I won't get too far into storyline specifics, I never do, but one of the major players in this expansion is Aymeric de Borel, who leads the Temple Knights and is more willing at making negotiations with those in Eorzea. He's a big player and has a large presence in the storyline even after Heavensward, and is the main individual credited for convincing the Archbishop to save the Warrior of Light and provide them shelter within Ishgard after the events of 2.5. Other major characters include Lady Iceheart, who has ties to Shiva and runs a group of heretics dedicating their efforts to helping the dragons. She was actually introduced in 2.4, but has a more prominent role within this expansion. Then there's Ystinian Wormblood, a dragoon who was introduced all the way back in 1.0, takes part in some of the Dragoon class questline, and becomes a much larger player within the storyline of Heavensward, tying in directly to the storyline dedicated to the dragon Nidhogg, and the Eyes of Nidhogg, which have a rippling effect throughout the storyline all the way until the end of Stormblood's initial main scenario quest in 4.0. There's a lot of major players introduced here story-wise to go over, but to avoid getting too specific, let's discuss the state of the land generally. The Dragonsong War is a conflict that takes place between the Holy See of Ishgard and the Dravanian Horde, aka the Dragons, and it's been going on for thousands of years. ever since the murder of Ratatoskr, a dragon and brood sister of Nidhogg. Ratatoskr was killed for her eyes, as dragon's eyes were learned to contain immense power, and this murder led to the conflict between Nidhogg, the other dragons, and the Holy See of Ishgard, known as the previously mentioned Dragon Song War. A specific factor in the storyline is how Nidhogg was also defeated by having his eyes removed, and one of said eyes is passed down through a set of Azure Dragoons who use its power to fight against the Dravanian horde. This is where you, the player, come in, attempting to aid Sir Aymeric in the protection of Ishgard and ending the Dragon Song War potentially peacefully. This leads the player down a long journey through the areas surrounding Abelathia's spine, learning more about the history of the Dragon Song War and who was truly in the wrong, and facing off against not only dragons but power-hungry religious zealots. There's even a touch of anti-capitalist, anti-monarchy rhetoric in there for you, if that's your thing. It's my thing. So it really covers all of its bases, and you start to learn very early on that the dragons aren't necessarily the pure villains that they've been made out to be. It's a great storyline and setting, potentially one of 14's best, only being trumped in my opinion by the Shadowbringer storyline, which is released in 5.0. Heavensward was definitely a high point of storytelling for the MMO and continues to be a great entry point for players who wish to skip A Realm Reborn, or a fresh start for those who have powered through all of the 2.0 storyline. Now with the groundwork set, I think we can get into what was actually added mechanically to the game, go over all of the new features, and discuss the changes to the battle system and class abilities that were offered, as well as big new additions to the world of Final Fantasy XIV that gives players plenty to do. One thing to note going into Heavensward is that all of the 2.0 and onward quests that were set to level 50 would not provide EXP and instead provide only Gil. Not only was this rectified with the release of the expansion, but MSQ quests from 1 to 49 would provide additional EXP on top of their original values. This meant it would be much easier for players to hit the level 50 checkpoint while progressing through A Realm Reborn and most likely enter into Heavensward content past level 50, giving them a head start for the expansion. So what are some of the most prominent and visible additions? Well, first, the most obvious may be the level cap increase. A Realm Reborn originally capped at a level 50, but with the release of Heavensward, that cap was raised an additional 10 levels to 60. This would be the game plan for all future expansions as well, raising the cap by 10 every expansion. With this new level cap came new abilities for all of the jobs found within A Realm Reborn, some being unlocked through leveling and some requiring the progression of new job quests, with players unlocking the next class for their job every 2 levels instead of every 5. This would also be the case for Disciples of Land and Hand classes as well for the time being. On top of upgraded jobs, there would be 3 new additions added as well, one for each of the Holy Trinity, which is a rarity in the present day of Final Fantasy XIV. It should be pointed out that Yoshi P is known to hint at least one of the jobs to be released before it's actually announced, usually during a fan festival, an event held as a type of expo for Final Fantasy XIV players and fans. While on stage, you may be able to spot Yoshi P in a specific graphic t-shirt, which could potentially indicate the job. For Heavensward, Yoshi P wore a shirt with the Batman logo on it, signifying that Dark Knight, a moniker used for Batman, would be one of the classes to be released, and this turned out to be the case. Alongside Dark Knight as a tank was the card drawing Astrologian as a healer and the Machinist as a new ranged physical DPS. Dark Knight specifically focuses on wielding 2 greatswords and uses the powers of darkness to bolster both their power and defense. Astrologian is a dedicated healing class. Unlike Scholars or White Mage that focus on shielding and regeneration respectively, Astrologian has the ability to use either or by switching stances or sects before battle. On top of this, they have another major mechanic in the form of drawing cards from a random pool of 6 specific options, each offering different benefits as buffs. This has been heavily simplified in the future, but at the time, Astrologians were very unique in the utility that they offered. Finally, Machinist worked as a ranged physical DPS, using not only firearms with various modifications, but also able to place down mechanical turrets that would attack as well. All of the jobs would start at level 30, which was 30 levels under the new cap established in 3.0. This would change in the next 2 expansions for new classes, however, with new classes only being 20 levels under the cap, but at the time, this would be a pretty big gap to cover if you wanted to experience Heavensward with one of the new options presented to you. Luckily, things like pre-order earrings that offer EXP boosts and the game's built-in armory bonus help circumvent circumvent a bit of the grind by making EXP plentiful. Heavensward was also one of the 3 current expansions to add a new race known as the Aura. The addition of a new playable race in the game isn't something that became a pattern in the expansions. While Aura were added in Heavensward, they wouldn't be brought to the forefront of the storyline as a race until Stormblood in 4.0, an expansion that had no new playable races. Following that, Shadowbringers would actually get 2 playable races, each gender locked, with the Viera plan to have a male option released in Endwalker, but we'll get to all of that in another video. Now, a big aspect of Heavensward is exploration, and there's plenty of new areas to explore, but as the name implies, players won't simply be doing this on foot. Rather, they'll have the ability to finally fly within 14, but not right away. Instead of adding an early arbitrary grind to unlock flying mounts similar to other MMOs, Final Fantasy XIV adds its own special arbitrary grind that's even worse than you may imagine. To its credit, the introduction of Aether Currents were a great way to incentivize players to explore the new areas on foot and see all that they have to offer, but in practice, they are some of the most boring exploratory nodes players are forced to find around the map if they want to be able to fly through it. And this has been the mechanic for each expansion moving forward. So what are Aether Currents exactly? Well, players will have a list of currents to find as they enter a new area, but they won't know exactly where they are. Instead, players have a special compass that conveys how far the nearest node is and in which direction. It's then up to the player to find it and interact with it. Players must do this several times in several locations and are generally locked off from reaching certain areas on foot until they progress through the main storyline. Not only that, but some Aether Currents are specifically locked behind side quests, meaning players need to find and complete these quests as well before being able to fly. Once all Aether Currents are unlocked, a player using a mount that has the ability to fly would have full traversal capabilities unlocked, making it much easier to get around the expansive maps introduced in Heavensward. While incredibly beneficial, this was technically fully optional to unlock, as players never actually needed flying to complete most of, if not all, of the side quests. Additionally, some players could help others get their Aether Currents early by inviting them to a party and allowing them to ride on a mount that could both fly and hold multiple people. Speaking of exploration, new locations included the Coerthas Western Highlands, which helped expand the wintry location of Coerthas, the Dravanian Forelands, which is known to be the home of many dragons and houses the Chocobo Forest, the Dravanian Hinterlands, which is one of the more annoying areas to traverse in the game, and also home to Edelshire, a hub village, as well as the resting place of the Primal Alexander. Then there's the Churning Mists, which is an ancestral home to both the Moogles and the dragons, and where you will be taking part in Moogle Beast Tribe dailies. The Sea of Clouds is another area of massive floating islands and houses the Vanu Vanu Beast Tribe. And finally, there is Aziz Law, which is considered a mysterious land raised into the sky by the Alligans long ago. It's originally hidden from view, but becomes visible during story progression and also houses many of the trials to be fought throughout the patches. Focusing back on the Dravanian Hinterlands for a moment, you could consider Edelshire another Mordona, and an area that would be built over multiple patches, gaining new structures and repairs with each release. In Heavensward, this was the main area players would generally reside for endgame unless in need of a market board or something, as most of the daily grinding content could be found here. Something I forgot to mention in the previous video is the inclusion of the Sightseeing Log, which is a set of points scattered throughout the various maps and locations that, if players reach, they can mark off in their logbook as a form of collection. These are generally fairly easy to find, but some can be a bit more complicated, especially in Stormblood. Moving on to some of the core gameplay content, players would be able to take part in the following dungeons, which I should have listed here. I won't get into all of them, but some of my personal favorites include the Vault, that while feeling incredibly long, was aesthetically pleasing and had players fighting against knights who would transform mid-battle and even use limit breaks against you. Another of my favorites is the Great Gubal Library, which houses the Demon Tome boss, a callback to the Demon Wall, but without the ability to fall off the map. The main gimmick to this fight wasn't that the tome would move toward you, but rather that you had to rush to the other side of it when it closed to avoid an instant kill AoE. For trials, Heavensward featured 3 main fights outside of dungeons. Thok Ask Thok, Hard and Extreme, had players face off against the Primal Ravana and features many returning mechanics you would expect to see in a trial, including the ability to fall off the map. The Limitless Blue, Hard and Extreme was a little more unique, however, and had players face off against the Primal Bismarck. Rather than fighting Bismarck directly, players are stationed on an island and fight through waves of adds until they can tether Bismarck to said island with giant chains, where they will then have to hit a weak point, attempting to break it up to 2 times in order to complete the event before their island breaks apart. This fight heavily relies on the tanks keeping certain adds away from each other, forcing the enemies to be split up and focused on. Finally, we have one of the coolest trials to ever exist in Final Fantasy XIV, the Singularity Reactor, where players face off against the soul of King Thordan, which the Archbishop places inside himself. This fight culminates in an homage to a summon from Final Fantasy VII known as Knights of the Round, and has all of Thordan's knights face off against the player, perform special limit break style moves, and ultimately end with a huge finisher. It's fantastic, cinematic, and beautiful, and I highly recommend both trying the hard and extreme fights, as they are incredibly rewarding mechanically. An interesting point about extreme trials is that totems were introduced to help alleviate some of the RNG in terms of drops. Players that completed an extreme trial would get a totem or page specific to that fight, and collecting enough of them would allow them to turn them in for equipment or potentially even mounts after a few patches released after the fights. Drops were still possible, but this was just another means of getting the items out of the fights. Heavensward also introduced one of my favorite raids, the Alexander series, or A1 to A12. The series started in the 3.0 major patch and allowed players to explore and navigate the sealed primal Alexander, who was a walking battle castle. In 3.0, the first 4 fights were under the Gordius moniker, and I believe completing content for these in their normal state not only progressed the Alexander storyline with Cid, but also would cause the primal to show itself more and more in the Dravanian hinterlands near Edelshire. If you remember in my last video, I talked about how the games were testing out the Savage moniker with the second coil of Bahamut. Now the development team decided to release each normal set of raids with a Savage set, which would be the primary means of rewarding endgame raiders with the best gear in the game. These are generally considered the hardest content in the game at release and require dedicated raid groups or statics that are willing to put in the long hours to learn a fight as well as grind for better items to make said fights easier. A1 to 4 normal were released in the 3.01 minor patch, and the Savage content was released in 3.05. An interesting tidbit of information is how brutal and overtuned A3S and A4S were specifically. The raids were so notoriously difficult and gear checked that statics were falling apart across all of the servers, and some mechanics had to be cheesed to even be completed. It was a temporary death to raiding in general for most people and led to a great migration to the Gilgamesh server on the Aether Data Center due to it being classified as the raiding server and making it, even to this day, one of the more popular servers to play on. For PvP, a new Seize mode was added to the frontline, but I never really took part in it. It was essentially a domination style game mode, I believe, and had players running around the map to capture nodes. Speaking of instanced content, the Duty Finder was handed a few additions as well. One of the biggest inclusions was the undersized party option, which allows any number up to the normal max to run a specific instance and retain their current level and stats while doing so. While some generic items won't drop in these instances, like mob drops and dungeons, players could still receive, say, extreme trial rewards at the end of a fight, meaning this made grinding for specific items like mounts significantly easier, and the players participating would generally be overpowered. A minimum eye level option was also added that syncs players to the lowest level possible for said instance, and new loot rules were possible to set up ahead of time, such as Loot Master, which allowed the party leader to control who gets what drop, and agreed only option to force an even roll for any item for all participating members. Moving on to the other major aspect of the core gameplay, there's plenty of questing to be had, not just with the main storyline, but side quests and additional content. Obviously, there's plenty of MSQ to take part in, but each of the new maps naturally come with their own sets of fates as well, and even a new hunting system introduced on release known as clan hunts, which can be unlocked as early as level 53. Rather than getting these through the Grand Company, you would obtain marks in Ishgard. It was a great way of earning both experience, gear, and miscellaneous items. Lev quests have also been consolidated into a single location, that of Ishgard, and this would be a theme for the rest of the expansions. Rather than forcing you to go to various locations to find different Lev NPCs, they could quickly arrive in town and talk to the various Lev mates who were grouped together. Additionally, a new grand scale form of Lev quest was introduced known as Temple Levs that was categorized similarly with Battlecraft, Tradecraft, and Fieldcraft. These specific events cost 10 allowance to take part in and would offer more abundant rewards, as well as some unique ones for Battlecraft tasks. While new beast tribes wouldn't be added until 3.1, the allowances for said quests was raised from 6 to 12 and would help players who wanted to raise the reputation of the numerous tribes that existed already. Players that reached level 60 and continued to take part in the endgame content would begin to earn the new tombstones for this patch, those being Law and Esoterics, with Esoterics being the limited tome at the time. I don't have much to say on these specifically, as tomes pretty much function the same for the rest of Final Fantasy XIV as the series, and continue to get cycled out with expansions and major patches. For that reason, I'm not going to list every single one being cycled out, just know that they do just constantly get cycled out, with Poetics always being kind of a staple and everything kind of falling back into it. The battle system in Heavensward remained generally the same, with some balancing and stat changes here and there. An example would be the skill and spell speed now affecting damage over time effects when this wasn't the case previously, and ranged physical DPS finally getting a line-based AoE as their limit break rather than utilizing the healer LB. Now, battle classes aren't the only ones to receive a batch of new content. Crafting and gathering classes also received not only 10 additional levels, but plenty to do before and into the endgame of Heavensward to keep them busy. On top of the cap being raised, Heavensward also introduced the specialist system, where players could set 3 of the 8 potential crafting classes as specialty classes, which offered not only a small stat boost, but unique abilities and recipes that could be used to create some unique endgame items. Additionally, this expansion saw the introduction of collectibles, which were used for various things, mainly earning EXP and gathering scripts. Scripts are a form of currency similar to tomes and are broken up between crafters and gatherers. They can also be used for a variety of things, including high-end equipment, new recipes, better gathering nodes, and more. There's plenty to be done with them and items to obtain. Mechanically, there is virtually nothing different between normal crafting and gathering versus the collectible variant. In fact, players simply had an ability that could turn off and on to signify if a craft would be for a collectible or done normally, meaning virtually any item could be a collectible. 2 major distinctions help define a collectible. 1, the item cannot be used like its normal counterpart because collectibles are specifically created for trading in. And 2, collectibles don't rely on percentage chances. Instead, raising the quality gauge directly raises the collectability of the item, with the highest collectability being a full quality bar. Generally, collectability is gauged in tiers when turned in, with a lower value offering the smallest rewards, a mid value offering slightly better rewards, and then a higher value close to the maximum offering the best rewards to the player. Desynthesis also received a level cap raise in this expansion, and Glamour Prism grades were adjusted to work with the new higher eye level equipment. On top of this, players could also lower the quality of high quality items. Why? I don't know. I'm sure there's a reason why, but I honestly have no idea. One of the final major inclusions in the initial release of Heavensward was the introduction of the company workshops, which could be purchased by an FC that owned housing and was used to create various things, including airships, which would then be used to take part in exploratory voyages, or upgrading ethereal wheels, which is an object I didn't mention in the previous video, but was implemented in 2.5. Ethereal wheels are furnishing items that can charge over time and can be used to apply FC buffs without spending company credits, and could then be upgraded further in the company workshop for better buffs. I won't get too in depth about the company crafting process specifically, but it was broken up into phases and generally required a certain number of members to be active within the workshop at a given time. Airships could be sent out on voyages for some time before returning with rare or unique materials. This would later be expanded on in the next patch with the introduction of the diadem, which players could actively travel to. I think this is the perfect segue now to leave the initial release of 3.0 and begin taking a look at all of the major patches and what those included. Patch 3.1, As Goes Light, So Goes Darkness, released the 10th of November 2015 and brought with it new storyline quests, the 24-man, and much more. The main thing you need to understand about Heavensward's storyline going forward is that these things never go away, ever. At least until the end of 4.0. This dude is also a pain in the ass until the end of the major patches, and is the main reason our main man, Robon, lost an arm back in A Realm Reborn. Throughout these patches, we will also see the spotlight shift onto the Warriors of Darkness, who have a rather large rippling effect through the storyline and lead to the main plotline of Shadowbringers, and the alternate world or dimensions surrounding that. It's crazy. Just trust me on that. Go watch a plotline recap if you haven't, because it's absolutely nuts. Possibly my favorite 24-man series released in this patch with the introduction of Void Arc, in which players are tasked with fighting various Void Sent as they explore a giant ghost ship. This entire 24-man series is Void Sent specific and actually culminates in a final fight down the road against a dungeon boss players would have faced already, and it's one of the most entertaining fights in a 24-man in my opinion until the release of Nier Automata raids and Shadowbringers. New dungeons included St. Mosian's Arboretum, where players explore the abandoned flora-filled area and fight many of the wildlife that have now taken over. For hard dungeons, Heavensward began only adding 1 new dungeon instead of 2 per major patch. In 3.1, the first introduced was Pharaoh's Serious Hard. Players would also be able to take part in Minstrel's Ballad, Thornton's Reign, which functioned as the extreme mode for the King Thornton trial. Now, generic exploration quests existed for the airships and free companies, but the developers of Final Fantasy XIV wanted to add something extra to companies that went through the trouble of creating an an airship and would also work on emulating the open-ended nature of their previous MMO, Final Fantasy XI. This led to the creation of the Diadem, an open, instanced area which could host up to 9 parties for a total of 72 players. Diadem still exists today, but it's almost completely different, to the point that the Diadem introduced in Heavensward has been considered retired. Players could form a party of at least 2 or even an alliance of 24 and use a free company airship to travel to the instance. Originally, the area would have various difficulty levels you could choose from when joining, those being easy, normal, and hard, with I believe drop rates of the chests being higher the more difficult you go up, making for a better challenge, a more rewarding challenge. Players could travel the area of the Diadem and complete various missions for rewards. Killing monsters also had a chance of dropping some chests that could reward players with rare items. All in all, it was fairly fruitful in terms of making money in the game, as it required a lot of work just to enter and then a lot of work within the area as well. Diadem also wasn't solely for battle classes, but for gatherers as well, as specific nodes could only be found there. The area would also spawn fates periodically. The Diadem specifically would update throughout patches and expansions, but this type of area and game mode would branch off into future expansions as new mechanics. Moving on, once at level 60, players unlock the ability to begin their anima quest. Anima weapons are the Heavensward form of relics and feature a similar grind in comparison to A Realm Reborn. This is one I never really took part in, however, so bear with me as we work through the steps together. Players could unlock the quest chain by talking to Rowena in Edelshire and completing the Unexpected Proposal quest. Then in Aziz Law, players would talk to Ardashir to unlock Soul Without a Life, where you are given an option. Players could either skip the first step of the quest chain by trading in their completed A Realm Reborn relic, or they could farm various fates until they got a rare crystal drop per major area in Heavensward. The drop rate of these crystals was around 20% and was buffed in patch 3.57. Once this first step was completed, players would receive their animated status weapon, although it still wouldn't have the purple relic icon. Following this quest, players could pick up the quest Toughening Up to change their animated weapon into an awoken one by completing 10 dungeons in a specific order, whether they be synced or unsynced. Finally, players could pick up Coming Into Its Own and would see this as the longest grind for this stage of the weapon. Players would need to collect a variety of tokens through various means, such as purchasing through daily beast tribe tokens, using poetics, and multiple other avenues. It probably wasn't poetics at that point, but it's poetics now. For the first set of tokens, they need 10 per unique item and then 4 per unique item for the second set. These items would then be traded for anima weapon materials, and then trade these materials to receive their anima relic weapon, which I believe would then be purple. Speaking of beast tribes, the Vanu were finally made available for daily quests that players could complete within the Sea of Clouds area. Some more minor additions include Lord of Verminion in the Gold Saucer, which would allow players to use their minions to fight competitively against one another. Minions have different traits and stats that allow them to trump other minions, and players can try and plan their teams accordingly. Minions are selected during a briefing period and then sent in during the engage phase. Players are then required to get their minions to destroy other players' Arcana Stones in order to win. There's more to it than that, and on top of player battles, there's also tournaments that you can take part in, but I won't be going too in depth about it here. 3.1 was also the introduction of the Scholasticate questline that lasted throughout the life cycle of Heavensward with various pauses in between, and it would eventually reward the player with a unique emote if completed. It focused on the storyline of the student body of Ishgard. Finally, a notable addition to 3.1 was the introduction of housing demolition, in which inactive accounts could see their houses forfeited automatically. If you watched my previous video or played Final Fantasy XIV already, it should be obvious why this was implemented, but as a brief refresher, there is simply nowhere near enough housing in comparison to the active population within a given server. For this reason, automatic housing demolition was introduced and worked as follows. After 30 days of inactivity, a timer is added to the timer interface to inform the player their home is preparing for demolition. Keep in mind, simply being online doesn't make this go away. Players have to actively visit and enter their home to remove this status. After 35 days, an email is sent out as a means to offer an additional warning to the player. After 42 days, another email is sent out letting them know they only have 3 days remaining. Finally, after 45 days of inactivity, the plot will be demolished. I have personally experienced losing a medium plot to this without realizing it because the emails went to my spam folder and I lost track of time. It's a painful process, but an understandable one given the housing climate in Final Fantasy XIV. That being said, even today, the better answer in my opinion is to bite the bullet and offer more housing overall. That's a discussion for another video though. In the meantime, let's move on to the next patch. Patch 3.2, the Gears of Change, released on the 23rd of February 2016 and saw new storyline quests, but more importantly, the continuation of the Hildebrand questline, which we haven't seen since the end of A Realm Reborn. The storyline focuses on helping an amnesiac Final Fantasy XIV mob known as Mehmet find out where it is from. The Mehmet is dressed like a black mage and named Gigi, most likely a reference to Vivi from Final Fantasy IX. Unlike in A Realm Reborn, the questline is purely for the storyline and doesn't lead to any specific instance content. For dungeons, a favorite of mine was added within 3.2, known as the Anti-Tower, and tasked players with exploring a giant upside-down castle-like structure from underground. However, much like the Arboretum, this tower is abandoned and now overrun with magical creatures. For the hard mode dungeon, the lost city of Amdapor was updated. This patch marked the start of a trio of trials to be released throughout the Heavensward life cycle known as the Warring Triad, a reference to similar characters from Final Fantasy VI. 3 major trials would be released, the first of which was titled Containment Bay S1T7 and housed Sephiroth, not Sephiroth. Sephiroth, a new primal for the players to fight against. I didn't personally fight Sephiroth until near the release of the 3rd trial with the Warring Triad questline, but the fight itself is incredibly entertaining, with Sephiroth eventually growing into a gigantic form for the players to deal with while getting thrown around the map. Raiders also saw the release of A5 to 8, known as Alexander Midas, with the Savage modes releasing in patch 3.25. Most of these fights were interesting in some way or another, but the final fight is particularly enjoyable due to players fighting multiple robots that eventually combine into a Megazord or Voltron style form known as Brute Justice. For PvP, a new seasonal event was added known as the Feast that is a form of ranked PvP. Ranked matches are entered solo, but there's also pre-constructed team matches as well. Players that perform well and win consistently rank up from bronze to silver to gold, and then finally to platinum and diamond. Having a high ranking offers various rewards, including unique armor that is generally locked away once the season ends, making it highly unique and valuable. Patch 3.25 also saw the release of the next step of the Heavensward relic, Anima Hyperconductive, and had players pick up the Finding Your Voice quest, which only required players to trade in 5 Aether oils. Said oils could be obtained via a weekly quest or through the trading of Poetics, though like I said, I don't think it was Poetics at the time, though this might be incorrect. For Beast Tribes, the Vath quest for the Nath race were unlocked in this patch and could be found in the Dravanian Forelands. Housing added several features as well, such as being able to preview dyeable furniture and the introduction of the Orchestrion, which would allow players to play various background music within their homes, with the music being collectible and craftable via duties. A new major feature to help newer players was the Hall of the Novice. Players could use this system to learn how to play their desired class archetype and even access a special chat hellscape known as the Novice Network. Allow me to elaborate in a second, but first I have to mention that on top of the game itself helping novices, players that met certain requirements could now become mentors and receive a special icon next to their names, while also taking part in mentor roulettes and helping newcomers in the Novice Network. In theory, this is all well and good. In practice, mentors often become mentors solely for the icons and roulette, while being generally unhelpful and even hostile to both other mentors and new players. Top that off with the Novice Network allowing mentors to kick out other players, and you have a pretty toxic environment overall, at least in my opinion. Mentors were broken up into 2 categories, either battle class mentors or disciples of hand and land. Originally, players just needed to max the level on any DPS, tank, and healing class, so they had one of each. They also needed to have completed a total of 1,000 instanced raids or trials and received at least 300 commendations. They could then apply and automatically receive mentor status. Disciples of Hand and Land were a little more forgiving, requiring players to max 1 crafter, 1 gatherer, synthesize 100 collectibles, and gather 300 collectibles total. Finally, Stone, Sea, and Sky was introduced and effectively acted as a training dummy with specific health pools and stats that players would wail on to see if they were within a certain gear stat requirement in order to properly be ready for an extreme trial or raid. Some groups would even require you to have completed these as proof you were ready for the fight, at least in some way. Patch 3.3 Revenge of the Horde released June 7th, 2016 and brought with it more storyline and the continuation of the new Hildebrand questline. One of the more unique and interesting mechanics was added and is still used to this day. Deep Dungeons, which acted as a roguelike style dungeon instance that could be participated in with parties of 1 to 4 people. It was potentially one of the most unique inclusions in the expansion due to all of its various mechanics, including its own semi-independent leveling system, and not requiring the user to wear any gear as it was provided and upgraded from within the dungeon. Starting with 50 floors on release, Palace of the Dead, the first deep dungeon, offered 50 randomized floors to be explored by players, being broken up into many small squares or rectangular paths. Players would be required to kill a certain amount of enemies in order to unlock a teleporter that would take them to the next level, and every 10 levels saw a new boss to be faced. The interesting thing is that players started this dungeon as a level 1 character without any of their abilities and quickly level all the way up to 60 as they progress through the floors. This is independent from the player's true level, which remains ineffective until 10 floors, where the player is offered an EXP reward. In fact, the EXP rewards were so plentiful that players would begin solely using this deep dungeon mechanic in order to level their alts. The one major downside to deep dungeons for learning a class is that positionals are not a factor, so it may leave characters unaware of certain benefits they are missing out on. Equipment is also different, with players receiving an Aether Arm and armor set that level up through collecting specific chests scattered around the map. Players that find silver coffers can open them and would then be rewarded with some levels in their Aether equipment, either their armor or their weapon. Say you open a silver coffer and your +3 Aether weapon gets upgraded to +4 or maybe even +5 or 6. These levels would offer offensive and defensive stat boosts and make progressing through the dungeon in future runs faster and easier. That's because the levels of your Aether equipment are persistent throughout runs in the dungeon, while players can reach a checkpoint every 10 levels, allowing them to leave and return to continue the dungeon whenever they like. Either completing the dungeon or resetting to floor 1 will not change the player's Aether level unless they decide to wipe their save data. If the player reached +60 on both their weapon and armor, they could choose to revert their equipment back to base level, but in return receive their Aether weapon for use in the main game. Floors would come with random buffs and debuffs randomly, and invisible traps could be placed around the map. Players could combat these and other factors with special deep dungeon items known as Pomanders, which they received from gold coffers. Pomanders ranged from providing stat boosts to debuffing enemies to creating better treasure drops, and even sometimes allowed the player to summon primals temporarily or transform themselves into beasts to make progression easier. Bronze coffers could also be found around the map and would generally offer potions. For new dungeons, players explored Sorkai, a palace in the Churning Mists, and was once home to Nidhogg and his brood. This is the dungeon where players fight against the great worm Hraesvelgr, who, I shit you not, fell in love with an Elysian woman named Shiva, who turned out to be the primal Shiva eventually in A Realm Reborn. Again, story specific. This patch also introduced Hullbreaker Eilhard. Players would also get to have what amounted to a final encounter against Nidhogg in a new trial known as the Final Steps of Faith, which also came with its own Minstrel's Ballad or Extreme mode, another really fun trial that I remember being convoluted in terms of positioning on the large battleground in Extreme. The second of the new 24-man series was also introduced, known as the Weeping City of Mach. This 24-man was particularly notorious for its inclusion of Ozma, an optional super boss from Final Fantasy IX. It was a convoluted fight where Ozma could take on various forms that would have various actions and generally required the party or even the alliance to work together and navigate more than is usual. While all of this is happening, players are on a thin circular disc-like platform that they can fall off of, so many wipes were had here. A new PvP mode was also added to Frontline known as Shatter, where players controlled various nodes on the map and also attacked various frozen nodes in order to fill an Allegan data gauge for victory. Anima weapons also continued their progression into the new reconditioned status, and this was one of the customizable aspects of the weapon. Players were tasked with collecting crystal sand and umbrite, which could be fused to make treated crystal sand between 3 or 6 at a time in the process. The treated sand would then be used on the relic to provide a single growth point up to a total of 240, and these points could be allocated into various attributes, each of which had its own limit. Moogles finally received their own Beast Tribe quest and were unique in that they were a set of dailies specific to crafters, offering various crafting specific rewards, as well as being a means of obtaining a decent bit of crafting EXP. Treasure maps were made more enticing this patch with the introduction of the Aquapolis. Sometimes when opening treasure chests, the portal would open and the party of adventurers would be sucked into the Aquapolis to take part in a form of minigame. Once inside, players could open a treasure chest, which would in turn force them into a fight against a set of mobs. Once complete, players would have a choice between 2 doors, one being the correct door and the other kicking you out. Choosing the correct door allows you to move down to the next area and repeat the process up to the 7th and final chamber. The further you make it, the better the rewards. Now consider that there is a 50% chance of the portal opening when opening the initial chest. Then there are 6 sets of doors to open, each with their own 50% chance of being successful. That means for every every portal you receive, there is a 1.56% chance of reaching the end of the dungeon, leading to a total of 64 runs on average to see the end. Continuing this, since the chance of the portal is 50%, players would statistically need to use up to 128 maps to see the end on average. While this might sound a bit ludicrous, the fun of these maps is the casual partying along the way, and even without reaching the ends, the rewards obtained can help you break even on the maps. This patch, the side quest icon was finally updated to have that little plus beside it if it offered something important. The raid finder was added and acted similarly to the duty finder's auto matching, but for high-end content. Players can now equip their best or optimized gear automatically with the push of a button on their character sheet, and mentor statuses gain the additional icons to specify what type of mentor you were, such as crafting or battle. Patch 3.4 Soul Surrender released September 27th, 2016, with new storyline, Hildebrand, and Scholasticade quests, as well as multiple major features that are still used to this day. For dungeons, a brand new instance known as Zelphatol was released, with players traveling to the mountainous region where the Ixal are again trying to summon Garuda. Additionally, the Great Gubal Library received an amazing hard mode addition. Containment Bay P1T6 was also released and faced players against the second member of the Warring Triad, Sophia. This fight was particularly enjoyable, with the included mechanics forcing players to navigate around the map that could sway from side to side, potentially knocking them off. A9 to 12 were released under the moniker Alexander the Creator. The fights in this specific set were fairly unique, but none more so than the final fight against Alexander Prime, which makes use of a lot of time manipulation mechanics that force the player to dodge attacks that are frozen on the map. PvP saw the introduction of duels in which players could enter a designated area to challenge one another to friendly PvP. It was mostly just there for the sake of it and didn't offer anything outside of messing around with friends. The next anima weapon step would allow players to reach sharpened status on their weapons and required them to earn 50 singing clusters, being able to gain 18 via a weekly quest, 1 via a daily quest, and multiple others via tombstone trading. Diadem also saw an update in the form of Hunting Grounds, which was a location specific to battle classes. One of the major new inclusions was Grand Company Squadrons, where players earned the ability to enlist recruits under their own squadron and train or deploy them into missions for various rewards. Deployed missions were similar to ventures in that they required you to wait a specific amount of time for the squadron to return. Each member you recruit had 3 main stats to consider, which were color-coded to red for physical, blue for mental, and yellow for tactics. Deployed missions had specific requirements for each of these, and players would need to train and create parties in order to at least get close to the suggested values. The closer you were, the more likely you were to see a deployment be a success. Eventually, this would be the means in which players could earn an extra rank within their Grand Company and raise the total amount of seals they could carry at a given time. The second major addition in this patch would have to be Wondrous Tales, which was a means of rewarding players even further for taking part in old content and is still used to this day. It's a weekly activity unlocked at level 60 where players pick up a journal from the Mikote child Chloe and Edelshire. Players would have a 4x4 grid of 16 goals that they could potentially complete, but not all 16 were required. Instead, 9 of their choosing would be necessary to complete the journal for the week, and tasks ranged from completing dungeons from a specific level range to specific 24-mans or trials and much more. Completing a task would reward the player with a seal or sticker that would be placed randomly on a 4x4 grid within the journal. Should players complete all 9 seals, they'd receive the base level reward. If they made a bingo of 1 to 3 lines, they'd receive extra tiers of rewards based on how many lines they achieved. On top of the basic mechanics, players could earn second chance points up to a total of 9 at a time by taking part in content with a player that has never completed said content before. These points could be used for 2 different effects. For 1 point, players could activate the retry effect, which would make one of the weekly tasks you already completed available again, while automatically marking a random task that hasn't been completed as completed. For 2 points, players could shuffle the stickers that they had already placed onto the journal for a better chance at receiving a line. Wondrous Tales was great for helping newcomers complete content due to how many veterans would be running it in order to complete their journals for the week. Palace of the Dead also saw the introduction of floors 51 to 100, and beyond that 101 to 200, and the inclusion of the Accursed Horde mechanic. Players that completed the first 50 floors of Palace of the Dead could begin running 51 to 100. In fact, I believe it's still 51 to 60 that most people run to help them grind their characters up from whatever level all the way up to the max. If players completed floors 1 to 100 as a party without leaving the dungeon or seeing a party wipe, they gain access to floors 101 and 200 for that run specifically, which gets incredibly difficult as you progress. However, reaching floor 200 can offer a unique mount and various other rewards that are of high value. The Accursed Horde functioned as a secret chest that may may appear on random floors. The chest was invisible and required players to stand on top of it for a short period of time to make it appear. However, there is a pomander that creates a beacon of light to indicate where the chest location is. Finally, a few miscellaneous updates included the addition of apartment complexes to housing districts and the G-pose function. Apartments aren't as intricate as they might sound, simply functioning as a small house's interior without a basement and no exterior plot for the player to customize. It's simply a means of allowing players to have their own personal internal area to customize and make use of. Funny enough, players can have both an apartment and a housing plot as well as a private chambers within an FC, meaning players can have 3 housing locations unlocked at any given time. Meanwhile, G-pose activated by typing /G-pose in the chat would allow players to take more elaborate screenshots in the game with more freeform camera movement and various visual effects including filters, depth of field, and much more. Now the final set of patches started with 3.5, The Far Edge of Fate, and released the 17th of January 2017. This patch finalized the storylines for the Hildebrand and Scholasticate questlines as well as finished off the Anima questline and much more. Balser's Wall is a particularly notorious dungeon that ends with the death of Papalymo of the Scions, who sacrifices himself to seal away the primal Shinryu, which leads directly into Stormblood. The dungeon itself is fine, but what makes it so notorious is the title that was received upon completing the storyline. Players can display titles beside their names for other players to see, usually unlocked via achievements. The one received for this specific storyline was Papalymo's Final Witness, heavily implying that he died. Considering players new or old can see titles at any point in the game regardless of their own progress, it was soon an issue of individuals, including yours truly, running around cities with the title and spoiling individuals. Alongside Balser's Wall, Som All also received a hard mode. Along with the 2 new dungeons and drama introduced, Containment Bay Z1T9 was also released, introducing the new primal Zervon and his extreme trial. Players fight the primal temporarily while it's sealed, only for it to shift soon after as Zervon is released and the full battle starts. The finale of the 24-man series, Dunscaith, was finally released as well and has a bit of history about it due to the eventual inclusion of a boss known as Proto-Ultima. In 2016 and 2017, a fan festival was held where players that attended could fight against a boss known as Proto-Ultima. For a while, this was the only way to experience the fight. However, one of the bosses in Dunscaith, the Shadow Court Handmaiden, would eventually be replaced with Proto-Ultima on subsequent runs, assuming at least one player has the repeatable quest Unidentified Flying Object. That means it is still possible to fight the Shrine Maid, but unlikely if in a matched instance. I mentioned this previously, but this is also the return of Diabolos as a boss fight, with 2 major phases and a transformation from Diabolos to Diabolos Hollow, and it's sick. It's sick. It's sick. It's awesome. The Anima questline could finally be completed as well by upgrading the weapon to complete and then Lux status. For the first phase, players need to complete a selection of dungeons and then gather Aether Density, similar to collecting light from the previous relic. After getting enough Aetheric Density and collecting 50 Numite, players would then be ready to move on to their Lux tasks, which included completing 15 separate trials and then turning in an Archaic Enchanted Ink. Once completed, players would unlock the final stage of their weapon and wouldn't see new relics until Stormblood. The Party Finder window received a major update in design as well as allowing players to match with others from different servers on the same data center. This foreshadowed the eventual release of the world visit system that would be released in patch 4.57. Summoners also unlocked an interesting mechanic that allowed them to cast a glamour on their individual summons for their Titan, Ifrit, and Garuda. Currently, all the way up to present day, this is the only inclusion of glamours for this ever introduced, and it was simply for 3 different colors of the Carbuncle pet, but that may change in Endwalker. Diadem was rebalanced and changed to 2 separate events rather than multiple difficulties. Trials of the Fury were released for battle classes, and Trials of the Matron were released for Disciples of Land. Players that haven't logged into the game for 45 days only to return would accurately receive a new status known as Returner and the ability to receive the Returner's Bounty, which would allow them to be back in the Novice Network and allow them to gain EXP rewards when playing with mentors, but only up to level 20, so effectively useless. A new way to earn Crafter and Gatherer EXP and eventually scripts was also unlocked in the form of custom deliveries. Players could talk to special NPCs who would list a set of items that they wish to receive, and players would be rewarded for delivering them as collectibles at high appraisal ratings. This was not only a great way to earn EXP and scripts, but also allow you to be friendly NPC and eventually even cast glamours on some of them. If A Realm Reborn was Final Fantasy XIV's revival, Heavensward was the proof that the MMO is going to survive for a long time within the growing world of free-to-play alternatives. Heavensward really managed to hit it out of the park by promoting exploration, introducing a new, engaging storyline, and releasing content that was so interesting and beneficial that it lasted throughout the lifespan of the entire MMO to this day. While the raiding scene may have had a rocky start, the rest of the content, including dungeons and especially trials, were simply fantastic additions to the game and provided some of the most memorable content I have ever experienced in my years playing. Heavensward has aged well, and that's because of how solid its setting, storyline, and content really are, and it really was fantastic to know that Final Fantasy XIV would be moving forward strongly for future releases, even if the next expansion is potentially the weakest out of them all. In the next video, we'll be going over Final Fantasy XIV's second and arguably weakest expansion, Stormblood, starting with patch 4.0. This expansion is particularly notable for introducing the underwater mechanics as well as featuring multiple design changes for classes and the battle system. If you enjoyed these videos and want to see more, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you like Monster Hunter, I have plenty of history videos on that particular subject as well, and I highly recommend checking them out. That's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. This is the Patreon section where I shout out everyone for pledging on Patreon. I really appreciate it. It helps support me in the channel and everything I want to do with it, helps pay my rent, etc. You're all amazing. There should be some credits here, probably, and I'm gonna go ahead and say thank you to a couple people. Thank you so much. Desparity, thank you so much for the G rank tier. I really appreciate it. I hope you're having a great day. Joyce Sanders, thank you so much for the G rank tier. Beyond the Time, thank you so much. Christopher, thank you so much. Nolan Brookman, thank you so much for the G rank tier. IBM 200, thank you for the G rank tier. Per-Gunnar Eriksson, thank you for the G rank tier, appreciate it. Atomicweapon, thank you for the G rank tier. Karantal, thank you for the G rank tier. Moh Al Qassemi, thank you for the G rank tier. xKNKYxKing, thank you for the G rank tier, appreciate it. Cyberworm, thank you for the G rank tier. Mogbit, thank you for the G rank tier as always. Kathleen Medjuck, thank you for the G rank tier. CrunchyKaoru, hi Gabe, thank you for the G rank tier. Johnathon, thank you for the G rank tier, appreciate it. Strangely, thank you for the G rank tier. BenVB, thank you for the G rank tier. LewdHifumi, thank you for the G rank tier. Justin Ragle, thank you for the G rank tier. And finally, Mr. Janky, thank you for the G rank tier. I really appreciate it, guys. On top of getting shouted out or in the credits in a video, you also get a role in the Discord based on which tier you pledge for. And that allows you into like a super secret Discord channel where we do stuff with it sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Check it out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.